Hey everyone, it's Mark. I'm back again with another Flight Simulator 2020 video. If you're struggling with transitioning from one phase of flight to the other, say from climb to cruise or cruise to descent, or you're simply looking to fly the airplanes in Microsoft Flight Simulator a little bit more smoothly, then this video is going to be for you. I'm going to explain how to fly any plane in the game by the numbers, which allows you to quickly and smoothly transition from one phase of flight to the next. Flying by the numbers means that for each phase of flight, you know ahead of time how the airplane needs to be configured. In other words, you know how much power, pitch, and flaps to apply to achieve a desired performance from the airplane. This makes transitioning from one phase of flight to the other that much easier because all you have to do is set the airplane to those configuration settings that you already wrote down, and like magic, the airplane is just going to fly how you want it to. It's also really useful if you're planning on learning to do some basic instrument flying in the game. It's one less thing that you have to worry about. You can just let the airplane fly itself and you can focus on making sure that you're following your instrument procedures properly. So you can see the different phases of flight that I use on the diagram that I've put just next to me. There are two different configurations for climbs, two different configurations for descents, and two for straight and level flight as well. For each of these phases, you're going to want to jot down how to configure the power, RPM, pitch, and flaps. The combination of all those settings is going to result in your airplane being in either an ascent, descent, or straight and level flight at a given airspeed. In fact, as we go through the video, you're going to see that the airspeed is what I use as my starting point to figure out how to configure everything else. I'm going to go more in depth on each one of the phases of flight and how to learn how to configure your airplane for them. But before I do that, I do want to remind you, if you do get some value out of this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. And if you have any comments or you want to critique something I did or said, feel free to put it below. Alright, let's take a little bit more of an in-depth look at the 6 different phases of flight. I'm on the ground getting ready for takeoff, and to figure out how to configure the airplane, I first checked the built-in checklists, but for many of the airplanes in the game, there just isn't enough information there. So in this case, I had to resort to finding an online version of the real pilot's operating handbook for the airplane. By looking through the procedures in the operating handbook, I found that takeoff is best done at around 104 knots, which is going to give me the best rate of climb for this airplane. With that little bit of information, I can figure out all of the rest. So I'm going to get ready to get going. So I'm just going to apply full power and let the airplane start accelerating. I moved into the slightly tighter view just because it'll be a little bit easier to read the instruments for you on the video. So as the power is increasing, I'm going to get to my rotation speed right there, and I'm going to slowly rotate to 5 degrees, and I'm going to try and let the airspeed of the airplane build up towards 104 knots. At this point, I'm going to retract the flaps as well. And I took note that before I retracted the flaps, the pitch I needed was around 5 degrees to continue accelerating towards my best rate of climb airspeed. Once I did retract the flaps, you saw that the pitch I needed to maintain 104 was much higher, more like 10 degrees or so. So in my notes, I wrote down that I need to stay somewhere between 5 and 11 or so degrees of pitch to maintain 104 knots on takeoff. A lot of these configurations are going to depend on the weather and altitude that you're flying from, but the pilot's operating handbook should have some details for short field takeoffs that you can take note of as well if you want. The takeoff phase usually doesn't last very long either. By the time you've reached pattern altitude, which is usually around 1,000 feet above the airport, you should be looking to transition to the next phase of flight, which is the cruise climb. That's what I'm going to do right now. The cruise climb configuration is going to take you from pattern altitude all the way to your cruise altitude, and it's optimized so you get a better view out of the cockpit with a slightly less aggressive pitch. I had to reverse engineer what the configuration for the cruise climb for this airplane would be. Obviously the flaps should be up, but other than a suggested airspeed of around 120 knots, I couldn't find much information. So what I started by doing is reducing my pitch to around 7.5 degrees. That got me the airspeed that I wanted, which is around 120 knots. It also resulted in around a 1,300 foot per minute climb. But almost immediately with that new pitch, I realized that the airspeed was starting to increase. So I had to reduce power a little bit to maintain that 120 or so knots. Once the airplane stabilized, I took note of the power, the RPM, the pitch, and the airspeed that this configuration gave me, so that the next time I want to fly the airplane in a cruise climb, all I have to do is reproduce these exact settings and the airplane is just going to fly like that, just like magic. Next up, it's time to configure the airplane for the phase of flight that usually lasts the longest, the cruise. I'm going to repeat the same process I did for the climb, but this time I'm going to hold the wings straight and level so that the airspeed builds up, but I don't continue to gain any altitude. My goal is to reach around 158 knots, and I can use the airspeed trend line, the little purple line on the right of the airspeed tape, to tell me how I'm tracking with regards to that objective. You can see that I've got the purple line up to around 160 knots. So that means I can start reducing power a little bit because I know that when I'm flying straight and level, I'm not going to need quite as much power to hold 158 knots. While that's happening, I'm obviously also adjusting the elevator trim so that I can release a lot of the pressure on the stick. If you need more details about how to adjust the elevator trim, check out the previous video I made on this topic. I'll make sure to add a link to it just right above me. And once again, with all of that set, the airplane is cruising along to its destination without me having to adjust any controls, maintaining a steady airspeed and a constant altitude. Just like the last time, I'm going to take note of the power, RPM, pitch, and airspeed that I needed to fly in straight and level flight so that I have it the next time I want to use it. Just like with all the previous phases of flight, I use the airspeed as my starting point to figure out how to configure everything around it from power to pitch and trim. You're probably starting to get the idea by now. It's time to figure out what numbers I need to use to descend to pattern altitude though. This time I'm actually going to reduce power first to avoid an overspeed, and then I'm going to pitch the airplane down to hold around 700 feet per minute descent rate. This is going to be a fairly comfortable descent rate because I'm in no rush to get down to the ground. The pilot's operating handbook told me that I should descend at around 130 knots. So I actually cut a lot of power in this case because otherwise my airspeed is going to stay up with that descent rate. As you can see, I ended up pulling the power almost all the way back to a quarter power to get down to the airspeed that I want. The pitch attitude ended up being around 2.5 degrees down to hold the descent rate as well. As usual, these exact settings are going to differ for each airplane, but by now you get the idea of how to figure out the numbers yourself. Figure out what the airspeed you want is as well as the vertical airspeed and adjust power and pitch to match. The second to last phase of flight is approach, which is a straight and level configuration to fly around the airport. The approach configuration gets you close to the landing configuration at an airspeed that's approaching final. Now, I couldn't find an exact airspeed to fly the approach in this airplane, so the speed that I'm using as my starting point is a little bit of a guess at around 105 knots. But I think that airspeed makes sense because it's just about in the middle between my final approach speed and my descent speed. Now, once you level off at pattern altitude, you need to keep a closer eye on your actual airspeed. The reason for that, of course, is because as you level off, your airspeed's going to start dropping pretty quickly. It's even possible you might have to add a little bit of power to be able to keep your airspeed up sufficiently to avoid a stall. Now, it's in this phase of flight that you can start to bring in some flaps to help slow you down. It's going to depend on the airplane that you're flying, of course, so you'll need to look up what's recommended for your plane. In this plane, I want to set it to the first setting, which is 15 degrees. But as Curtis pointed out in the comments of a previous video I made, there is a maximum flap extension speed at which you can extend the flaps. There's a similar airspeed if you have retractable landing gear as well. It's probably a good idea to take note of those. But for flaps, it's actually really easy to know when you can extend that first level. If you're in that white area of the airspeed indicator, it means you can extend at minimum that first level of flaps to help slow you down. If you're flying too fast to extend that first level of flaps, what I would recommend is dropping the power just that wee little bit more to get yourself into that nice little safe area where you can extend them. And of course, I'm starting to sound like a broken record at this point, but take note of the power, the pitch, the flaps, and the resulting airspeed that you get for your approach configuration. Finally, it's time for the landing configuration. This is where having the flight profile ahead of time is really useful because you don't have that much time to configure the plane for a stable landing. I'm just joining the traffic pattern right now, and I'm still holding on my approach configuration, but in a couple of seconds I'm going to start my descent towards the runway. Final approach in this airplane is done at around 85 knots as indicated in the operating handbook. Again, I'm going to use that airspeed as a guide to figure out how to configure everything else in the airplane to get to that 85 knot descent rate. I'm going to extend the last flaps in a couple of seconds to slow the airplane down a whole bunch more towards that 85 knots. That means I likely won't need to adjust the power again, and that's because that last level of flaps is really going to add a lot of drag to the airplane, and it's likely that I'm just going to be able to let the plane settle down to 85 knots without adjusting the power, or maybe just adding a little bit of power if necessary. Now, the ideal descent rate when you do start your descent is around 2.5 degrees. It is a little bit tricky to figure out when to start that descent, and I've done it just now because I'm a little bit closer than usual to the runway. 2.5 degrees is also what's going to be indicated on the landing lights that we're going to see in a couple of seconds once I'm on final. In this airplane, 2.5 degrees pitch down results in around 600 to 700 feet per minute, and it's going to be just right to get you down to the airport. Now, as you can see, as I'm turning final, my airspeed's getting a little low, so I'm actually going to add a little bit of power to make sure that my airspeed doesn't drop too much. Again, I kept an eye on the airspeed trend indicator, that little purple line to the right-hand side of the airspeed tape. Landing is really where I use the profile more as a guide than a rule because there is just so much variation, and depending on the weather conditions, things might be slightly different. So you do have to always be aware of your airspeed and your descent rate and constantly be making modifications. If you want more information on how to do a proper landing, I did do another video that went into a deep dive into how to land with visual flight rules. I'll make sure to put a link to it in the video. And then it's really just a matter of flying the airplane down, so you can see my airspeed settle down just a touch slower than it should be, at around 82, 83 knots. But my descent rate is nice and perfect, and I just have to follow this the whole way in. As we've seen, there are a few advantages to flying the airplane in this way. It's going to free you to focus on other things, the plane's behavior is going to be a lot more predictable than it would be otherwise, and you'll be able to detect mistakes in configuration. For example, if I had forgotten to extend the flaps as I started my turn towards base and final, I would have realized it pretty quickly because my airspeed would have been much higher than it was supposed to be for final. Alright, and now that we are on the ground, that is pretty much all I wanted to show you for this video. Hopefully with the previous video I made on how to fly an airplane and this one, you have a good idea to figure out anything you might need to fly an airplane visually in Flight Sim. But as usual, if you have any questions or comments, or you want to critique something I did, feel free to put it in the comments below. And if you got some value out of the video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.